The story begins with Mia, an 8-year-old girl with bright, sparkling eyes filled with hope. It was her first flight to New York City, where she would reunite with her family's closest friends. Mia had been preparing for this trip for a long time, eagerly waiting for the moment to arrive. She wore her favorite pink dress and tied her hair into 2 neat braids, looking like a little angel ready to take off into the sky. In Mia's hands was a soft teddy bear, her inseparable travel companion. The bear had small tears on its body, signs of the love Mia had given it since she was very young. She called it Teddy, and whenever she felt anxious, Teddy was always there to bring her a sense of safety. As Mia stepped into the airport, her wide eyes sparkled with curiosity. She gazed around in wonder, amazed by the bustling crowds and the hurried movements of travelers. Everything was new and exciting for a child like Mia. She knew she would soon meet relatives she hadn't seen in a long time, but what excited her the most was the chance to fly above the white clouds, imagining them as cotton candy mountains floating in an endless sky. Mia's mother, Emily, was a tall woman with warm eyes and a resilient smile. Despite her busy schedule, juggling 2 jobs to support her family, Emily had made sure to plan this trip carefully. The journey to New York, where she would reunite with close friends and celebrate an important occasion, was a great source of motivation for her. Emily hadn't flown in nearly a decade, so a mix of excitement and nervousness stirred within her. However, she was determined to make this a wonderful experience for Mia, ensuring that her daughter would carry home beautiful memories of their family reunion. Determined to stay calm and composed, especially for Mia's sake, Emily felt confident in her ability to handle any situation. She knew that no matter how challenging the trip might be, she would always remember her mother's advice: stand tall no matter what life throws at you. The flight was expected to last about 2.5 hours. The airline they had chosen was reputable and reasonably priced. The airplane cabin was clean, with seats arranged in a standard layout. Overhead compartments were already filling up as passengers hurried to board, scrambling for space to store their carry-on luggage. Mia's eyes darted around non-stop, observing everything around her, from the overhead signs to the seat pockets and the windows that would soon reveal a vast, open sky. She tugged at her mother's sleeve several times, whispering questions about how long the plane's wings were, why the engines made such a loud rumbling noise, and whether they would see birds flying alongside their flight. Emily answered with a gentle smile, sometimes accompanied by a playful shrug, reminding Mia to stay quiet as other passengers made their way down the aisle. Their flight attendant, Harriet, was assigned to the section where Emily and Mia were seated. From the moment Harriet laid eyes on Mia's bright, eager face, there was a noticeable hesitation in her expression. She forced a stiff, fleeting smile that quickly disappeared. Harriet was a tall, slender woman with neatly tied blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that constantly seemed to assess everything around her. At times, in fleeting moments, the gaze carried an unmistakable hint of displeasure. Cold and dismissive, Harriet had worked for this airline for nearly 15 years. Many of her colleagues considered her hardworking, even strict, but the truth was that Harriet harbored deep-seated prejudices, one she had tried to mask beneath a professional exterior. She took pride in maintaining a flawless image, though small cracks in that facade would sometimes slip through. Her personal world had grown increasingly rigid after a few disappointments in life, and she rarely let her guard down. Beneath her stern demeanor, Harriet concealed simmering frustrations, which she channeled into sharp judgments, often directed at passengers she deemed unworthy of respect. Ebony's mother, unaware of Harriet's deep-seated prejudices, simply assumed that the flight attendant was in a hurry and a bit tense. Jacqueline understood that flight attendants had demanding schedules, so she tried not to let Harriet's cold demeanor bother her. She simply offered a polite smile and gently guided Ebony to her seat by the window. Ebony's small feet swung back and forth, lightly tapping the seat in front of her. Jacqueline leaned down and softly reminded her daughter to stay still. Ebony giggled, hugging her stuffed animal, long neck, tightly to her chest and promising her mother that she would try her best to sit still. As other passengers continued boarding, an off-duty FBI agent named David Morales made his way down the aisle. David was of average build, with short black hair and a calm yet confident demeanor. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being in control, yet there was a warmth and understanding in his gentle gaze. He was on his way to Florida, looking forward to a week-long vacation. Even though he was officially off-duty and traveling with his sister, David couldn't shake the instincts ingrained in him from years in law enforcement. The daily pressures of his job had started to wear him down, and all he wanted was a little time to relax, to escape the city for a while. Despite being on leave, David still found himself scanning his surroundings, unable to ignore the small signals he had been trained to recognize throughout his career. As he reached for the overhead compartment to stow his luggage, his eyes briefly met Ebony's. The little girl flashed him a bright, innocent smile, the kind that children often use to greet strangers. David nodded in return, genuinely charmed by her purity and excitement. In that brief moment he felt an unconscious sense of protection toward Ebony. Her glowing face and the curiosity in her eyes reminded him of his own niece. David found his seat a few rows behind Jacqueline and Ebony, close enough to notice any potential disturbances. Before takeoff, Harriet walked down the aisles, checking seat belts, overhead compartments and tray tables. When she reached Jacqueline's row, she stopped, visibly irritated by the soft humming coming from Ebony. Though the little girl wasn't making much noise, Harriet still shot her a disapproving look that made Ebony tense up. Without another word, Harriet turned away and began the safety demonstration, neglecting to smile or greet Ebony despite the child's wide-eyed curiosity. Jacqueline whispered words of reassurance to her daughter, gently redirecting her attention to the safety pamphlet. Ebony whispered back, saying she was just excited to see the clouds. Jacqueline smiled softly, telling her they would soon be soaring through the open sky. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Ebony clutched her mother's hand, her eyes shining with excitement. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's roar, that it felt like butterflies were fluttering inside her stomach. Jacqueline patted her daughter's hand, reminding her to take deep breaths to stay calm. Meanwhile, strapped into her flight attendant's seat, Harriet kept her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. It was difficult to tell what she was thinking, but her expression made one thing clear: she was not pleased. David Morales sat in silence, his hand resting lightly on the armrest as he observed everything happening in the cabin. After takeoff, Ebony was initially thrilled by the sensation of ascending. She gazed out the window, fascinated as the city below grew smaller and smaller, the cars and buildings now reduced to tiny dots, neat little squares and rectangles scattered across the landscape. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Ebony let out a breath of admiration, a bright smile spreading across her face. Jacqueline exhaled in relief, happy that her daughter was adjusting so well. Not long after, Harriet began the drink service. She pushed the beverage cart down the aisle with mechanical efficiency, keeping her interactions with passengers brief, almost cold, especially if they failed to meet her personal standards of politeness. She seemed noticeably more at ease when speaking with a young couple who appeared refined and well-mannered. Harriet offered them slightly more courteous gestures before moving on. When she reached Jacqueline and Ebony, however, her tone sharpened. Jacqueline gently requested an apple juice for Ebony and a cup of water for herself. Eager to be polite, Ebony made sure to say, "Please," and "Thank you." However, as Harriet's gaze flickered over the little girl's face, there was a fleeting hint of hostility, something subtle, something Ebony was too young to fully grasp. Harriet poured the apple juice into a cup, but when she placed the plastic cup onto the tray, she set it down with just a little too much force, causing the liquid to ripple, nearly spilling over the edge. Jacqueline pressed her lips together, concerned but unwilling to escalate the situation. She simply thanked Harriet in a calm tone, not wanting Ebony to sense any tension. A few rows back, David noticed the way Harriet placed the drink in front of Ebony. Something about it felt off. Harriet had been cold to other passengers as well, but there was a sharpness in the way she treated Ebony, something more deliberate. David reminded himself to stay alert, even though there was no immediate reason to intervene. He had witnessed subtle moments of discrimination before, often so well hidden that most people would overlook them. But David's instincts told him something wasn't right. Ebony, unaware of the difference in treatment, took a small sip of her juice, still lost in her own little world. Jacqueline, trying to distract her daughter, asked if she wanted to color in her sketchbook. Ebony immediately nodded with excitement, rummaging through her small bag filled with crayons and colored pencils. Her face lit up at the thought of drawing her favorite cartoon characters. As Ebony began sketching two giraffes dancing on the clouds, Harriet maintained her professional appearance, but inside, anger simmered. She felt an irrational irritation toward Ebony's presence, as if the little girl's enthusiasm was some kind of personal provocation. That unjustified frustration only grew stronger each time Harriet glanced back. The airplane aisle had quieted as passengers settled in. Ebony finished her juice, leaving the empty plastic cup on her tray table. Harriet stopped by to collect trash. Ebony, deeply focused on her drawing, didn't notice Harriet standing there. When Jacqueline realized, she gently reminded Ebony to hand over her cup. Ebony quickly complied, passing the cup to Harriet. But Harriet snatched it from her hand, the action unnecessarily rough. Her tightly pressed lips and stiff demeanor radiated a clear sense of displeasure that Jacqueline couldn't quite understand. Harriet said nothing. She simply turned and continued down the aisle. David, sitting a few rows back, had witnessed the entire interaction and frowned. He told himself that perhaps Harriet was just having a bad day and that it might not be anything serious. However, the tension in the air was unmistakable, and David continued to observe Harriet through his peripheral vision. For the next hour, Ebony alternated between gazing out the window at the clouds and adding more details to her drawings. Jacqueline, exhausted from her work responsibilities, dozed off for a while. Ebony remained calm, occasionally humming a tune as she colored. At one point, Ebony unfastened her seatbelt to adjust her dress. From the front of the cabin, Harriet immediately issued a sharp reminder that seatbelts must remain fastened unless a passenger was using the restroom. Ebony quickly buckled up again, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face. Jacqueline woke up, quickly apologizing on her daughter's behalf, but Harriet walked away without responding. David watched Harriet as she moved on, the pieces in his mind slowly falling into place. He had noticed how Harriet had greeted other passengers with much more friendliness. She had remained polite, even to those who made small mistakes, like forgetting to fold up their tray tables, yet every minor action from Ebony seemed to irritate her. David had been trained to recognize subtle cues in body language, tone, and repeated behaviors. This wasn't just a flight attendant exhausted from a crowded flight. This was something deeper, an underlying hostility carefully masked by a professional facade. Around this time, Ebony mentioned that she needed to use the restroom. Jacqueline took her to the back of the plane. Ebony, being so small, had to stand on her tiptoes just to reach the sink. She marveled at the tiny space, exclaiming in surprise that she had never imagined an airplane bathroom could be so small. Jacqueline chuckled and reassured her daughter that it was okay. Once they arrived in Orlando, they would have plenty of space. Ebony found that amusing, her laughter echoing in the cramped bathroom. As they exited, Ebony was cheerful, walking lightly down the aisle while holding her mother's hand. Harriet, returning from the front of the plane, caught sight of Ebony's bright smile, and for some inexplicable reason, a bitter feeling rose within her. Saying nothing, Harriet brusquely pushed past the mother and daughter, forcing them to step aside. Jacqueline and Ebony exchanged a puzzled glance. Back at their seats, Ebony hesitated before softly asking her mother if something was wrong with the flight attendant. Jacqueline wasn't sure how to explain, so she simply said that sometimes, people go through things we don't understand. Ebony nodded, but a hint of doubt lingered on her face. From his seat, David observed the moment from the corner of his eye, taking note of Ebony's expression. It was the look of a child trying to piece together a situation she couldn't quite make sense of. David clenched his jaw in silence, disapproving of Harriet's actions. The flight continued smoothly for another 30 minutes. David distracted himself by reading a novel on his phone. He was halfway through a chapter when Harriet began the snack service. She handed out snack bags to passengers, but when she reached Ebony, she simply tossed a packet of peanuts onto the tray without even looking at the little girl. Jacqueline, who was allergic to peanuts, noticed immediately. She quickly grabbed the packet before Ebony could open it. Ebony flinched, looking up at her mother in confusion. Jacqueline turned to Harriet and explained that Ebony might also have a peanut allergy, so they always avoided them. Harriet shot her a cold glance and replied that Ebony should have mentioned it beforehand. Snatching the peanut bag from Jacqueline's hand, Harriet replaced it with a small packet of sweet biscuits. Jacqueline opened her mouth as if to say something, but then decided to remain silent. David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the tension rising. Although Harriet's behavior was clearly rude, David still wasn't sure if it was serious enough to justify official intervention. However, he couldn't ignore the pattern. Every dismissive action, every condescending glance, every curt remark, every subtle jab. He told himself that at some point, Harriet might cross the line. David had seen discrimination many times before, sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle. Through his training, he had learned that ignoring small injustices could allow worse actions to escalate. He reminded himself to stay alert, to remain vigilant. There were about 40 minutes left before the plane landed. The plane jolted violently due to turbulence, and Ebony let out a startled scream, clutching tightly onto her mother's arm. Jacqueline gently rubbed her daughter's back, whispering reassurances that this was normal. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, instructing everyone to remain seated and fasten their seatbelts. Harriet began walking up and down the aisle, ensuring that passengers were complying with the safety instructions. When she stopped at Ebony's row and noticed the little girl's trembling hands, instead of offering reassurance, Harriet coldly told Ebony to stop making noise. Jacqueline felt a wave of frustration but simply whispered to Ebony that everything would be okay. Ebony swallowed her tears and nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. David's chest tightened at the sight. The turbulence worsened, making the plane dip and rise. A few passengers gasped in alarm. Ebony whimpered softly and Harriet, standing in the aisle, glanced over, then suddenly rolled her eyes. David had the distinct feeling that Harriet muttered something under her breath, but he couldn't make out the words. Ebony's fear was evident, while Jacqueline did her best to comfort her daughter. Finally, the turbulence began to ease, and the pilot announced that the plane would soon begin its descent. Harriet seemed to relax slightly. Jacqueline asked Ebony if she was feeling better, and the little girl nodded, still clutching her stuffed animal long neck tightly. Harriet walked through the cabin, performing her final checks. As she passed by again, Ebony innocently asked if everything was okay now and if the turbulence was over. Harriet abruptly turned around and, in a sharp, icy whisper, told the little girl to be quiet and stop bothering people. Ebony's eyes widened, her tears threatening to spill over again. Jacqueline opened her mouth to speak, but Harriet shot her a warning glare, one that carried an unspoken message: "Don't make this a problem." In that moment, David clenched his fists under the tray table, struggling to restrain himself from confronting Harriet right then and there. However, he decided to remain patient, believing it would be better to handle the situation after landing through a formal complaint. There was no need to escalate things mid-flight. But then, as Harriet turned away, Ebony took a soft breath, just a quiet inhale. And somehow, that was enough for Harriet to spin back around, her face twisting into an uncontrollable fury. Through gritted teeth, she snapped that this was an airplane, not a playground, and Ebony needed to behave appropriately. Jacqueline, filled with both protectiveness and outrage, told Harriet that she had no right to speak to a child that way. Harriet shot back, saying she knew exactly how to deal with ill-mannered children. David unbuckled his seatbelt, ignoring the illuminated sign instructing passengers to remain seated. He stood up, ready to intervene. But Harriet brushed past him, muttering under her breath about how parents these days never discipline their kids. Ebony trembled as Jacqueline wrapped her arms tightly around her, whispering reassurances. Just moments later, Harriet returned from the front of the plane. But this time, her expression was no longer just irritation. It was rage. A deep, seething fury burned in her eyes as she marched straight toward Ebony's row, completely disregarding David's firm warning for her to calm down. Then, with sudden, shocking hatred, she looked directly at Ebony and spat out a racial slur. The entire cabin froze. Passengers around them stiffened in shock. Jacqueline's eyes widened in sheer horror and fury. Ebony, though too young to fully grasp the weight of the words, could still sense the hostility, the undeniable threat. David immediately stepped into the aisle, his heart pounding. Jacqueline instinctively tried to shield Ebony, positioning herself between her daughter and Harriet. But Harriet shoved her aside. Harriet smirked wickedly, then yanked her hand back, and threw a brutal punch at Ebony's arm. The blow, sudden and forceful, was horrifying, made even worse by the sheer contrast of her strength against the little girl's small frame. Ebony let out a blood-curdling scream. Jacqueline lunged forward, shielding her daughter as tears streamed down her face. A wave of horror swept through the passengers. Some gasped in shock. Others sat frozen, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Trained to react swiftly, David sprang into action, grabbing Harriet's wrist before she could strike again. Jacqueline clutched Ebony tightly against her chest, sobbing, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. David twisted Harriet's arm behind her back, his voice steady but firm as he identified himself as an off-duty FBI agent. Harriet thrashed against his grip, screaming that no one had the right to restrain her. David didn't flinch. "You just assaulted a child," he stated coldly. "And I am law enforcement." The panic in Harriet's eyes deepened as the gravity of her actions finally sank in. Several passengers stood up, forming a protective barrier around Ebony and Jacqueline. Others frantically called for assistance from the flight crew. The captain, aware of the commotion, made an announcement over the intercom, instructing everyone to remain seated. A young flight attendant named Lucy rushed over, her face pale with shock at the scene unfolding before her. She had never liked Harriet's attitude, but she never imagined she would resort to violence. Lucy apologized repeatedly to Jacqueline and Ebony, clearly shaken. Ebony sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her bruised arm while Jacqueline struggled to contain both her anger and fear, focusing instead on comforting her daughter. Lucy asked if Ebony needed medical attention and Jacqueline, still trembling, replied that Jacqueline, maintaining her composure despite the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her, gently stroked Ebony's back, trying to suppress her own fury and terror. Meanwhile, David kept a firm grip on Harriet, ensuring she couldn't break free. Harriet swung between making excuses, pleading, and spewing insults. She insisted that Ebony had been disrespectful, that the girl needed to be disciplined, which only fueled David's anger further. He firmly informed Harriet that she was being placed under citizen's arrest until law enforcement could take over. Harriet's voice wavered, turning into desperate pleas as she begged David to let her go. But he remained unmoved. Calmly, he stated that assaulting a child was a serious crime. Nearby passengers began pulling out their phones, recording the entire ordeal, capturing every frantic justification, every increasingly desperate attempt Harriet made to defend herself. Realizing the severity of the situation, the captain instructed David to escort Harriet to the area near the cockpit, where she would be held under supervision until landing. With Lucy's assistance, David led Harriet toward the front of the plane. Harriet continued protesting. At one point, she even broke down in tears, claiming that her career was being destroyed and that Ebony's behavior had caused her outburst. David, unfazed, responded in a measured tone. There is no excuse for violence against a child. And there is certainly no justification for racial slurs. Seeing Harriet's anger persist, David maintained his composure, while Jacqueline held Ebony tightly, soothing her. Other passengers offered Jacqueline tissues, words of support, and even phone chargers so she could contact her loved ones upon landing. Ebony's small body trembled as she sobbed, her voice breaking as she asked her mother why the flight attendant hated her so much, and what she had done wrong. Jacqueline, her eyes brimming with tears, could only pull her daughter into a protective embrace, unable to find the right words to answer such a heartbreaking question. Softly, she whispered to Ebony that she had done nothing wrong, that sometimes people carried hate inside them, a hatred they couldn't control. Ebony clung to her stuffed giraffe, her face filled with confusion and hurt. Lucy returned with a small ice pack, gently placing it on Ebony's bruised arm. Jacqueline thanked her, tears still shimmering in her eyes, but relieved that at least someone on the flight crew had shown kindness. Lucy apologized profusely, assuring Jacqueline that Harriet's actions did not reflect the values of the airline. Ebony nodded faintly, pressing the ice pack against her bruised skin. Jacqueline thanked Lucy again, her voice still choked with emotion. Just then the overhead speakers crackled to life. The pilot's voice rang through the cabin, announcing that they would be making an emergency landing due to a serious incident on board. He instructed all passengers to remain seated and fasten their seatbelts as the aircraft prepared for a rapid descent. At the front of the plane, David maintained his firm grip on Harriet, keeping a safe distance. He noticed her uniform was slightly disheveled from the struggle. Harriet wavered between silent tears and bursts of rage. She lashed out, accusing David of not doing his job properly and of letting criminals go free. David didn't react. He focused instead on the pilot's instructions, bracing for landing. He had dealt with many criminals attempting to justify their actions throughout his career. And Harriet's racially charged outbursts, though deeply disturbing, were sadly not unfamiliar to him. David remained steadfast in his resolve. He was determined to bring justice to Ebony. The flight landed quickly, touching down smoothly on the runway. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by Ebony's occasional sniffles and Harriet's muttered complaints. The pilot taxied the plane to a stop, while passengers remained stunned by what had just unfolded. As the aircraft reached the gate, local police officers and medical personnel were already waiting outside. When the doors finally opened, David stepped forward, introducing himself to the officers and swiftly recounting the assault. Harriet tried to interrupt, but the officers wasted no time. With practiced efficiency, they snapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and escorted her off the plane. Ebony, still shaken, was carefully examined by a paramedic. The bruise on her arm was prominent, but thankfully there were no signs of fractures. Jacqueline stood close to her daughter, protective and unwavering, thanking the paramedics for their care. Around them, passengers offered their support, many volunteering to send any footage they had recorded as evidence. An elderly man handed Jacqueline his business card, introducing himself as a lawyer. He assured her that he was more than willing to assist in any legal action against Harriet, and possibly even the airline. Jacqueline felt overwhelmed with gratitude, sorrow, and lingering anger. Ebony clung to her mother, her face still streaked with tears, a mixture of relief and lingering confusion in her eyes. David approached them once Harriet had been taken away by the police. He crouched down to Ebony's eye level, offering a gentle smile. "You were very brave," he said. Ebony sniffled, then whispered a soft "thank you for stopping the flight attendant." David assured her that Harriet would never be able to hurt anyone like that again. A flicker of cautious relief appeared in Ebony's eyes. Jacqueline reached for David's hand, squeezing it tightly, gratitude pouring from her heart. David asked if they had someone waiting for them at the airport. Jacqueline explained that her cousin, Latrice, was expecting them. David offered to stay with them until Latrice arrived and Jacqueline agreed. Ebony seemed a little calmer now. With David by their side, Jacqueline looked at him as a hero, the man who had stopped a nightmare from spiraling any further. Local authorities collected statements from David, Jacqueline, Ebony, Lucy, and multiple passengers who had witnessed the assault. Some people were still shaken, recalling the suddenness and violence of Harriet's outburst. Lucy, her eyes brimming with tears, explained that while Harriet had always been cold, sometimes even rude, she had never imagined Harriet would attack a child. She apologized once again to Jacqueline and Ebony. David could see the guilt weighing on her, as if she blamed herself for not recognizing the warning signs earlier. Jacqueline tried to stay composed, but her voice occasionally trembled as she recounted the entire flight. From Harriet's hostility to the moment she struck Ebony. The police took detailed notes, requested contact information, and assured them that Harriet would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. David added, calmly, that he had identified himself as an FBI agent, which only escalated the severity of Harriet's reckless actions. One of the officers nodded, glancing toward Harriet before shaking his head in disbelief. He then turned to David. "Thank you for your quick intervention," he said. Meanwhile, arrangements were being made to escort Harriet to the local police station. The medical staff completed Ebony's evaluation, confirming that she had no serious injuries aside from the bruise. Jacqueline could barely process the overwhelming relief of knowing her daughter hadn't suffered severe harm. She gently stroked Ebony's head and reassured her that they could still make it to Latrice's bakery grand opening, though they might be a little late. Ebony gave a small nod, still a bit dazed, but she seemed more at ease. The weight of the incident still lingered in Ebony's young mind. Sensing this, David offered to help them settle in the airport lounge until Latrice arrived. Jacqueline accepted, deeply grateful for his comforting presence. As they walked forward, Ebony clutched David's hand tightly for a moment, as if seeking reassurance that the danger had truly passed. Outside the security area, a group of reporters had already gathered, drawn to the dramatic nature of the emergency landing. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward. David immediately noticed Ebony flinch at the sudden attention. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of her, shielding her from the barrage of questions. Jacqueline, furious, glared at the reporters. She made it clear that Ebony needed privacy and that they would not be making any statements at this time. One reporter still pushed forward, demanding to know if the airline should be held responsible for a racist flight attendant. Another attempted to snap a picture of Ebony. David raised a firm hand, calm yet commanding, instructing them to step back and respect the child's space. An airport security officer intervened, pushing the reporters further back. As the crowd finally dispersed, Jacqueline let out a long breath of relief. David led them to a quiet seating area, away from the commotion, where they could rest and wait for Latrice. He noticed that Ebony was still trembling, likely overwhelmed by the media frenzy on top of all the earlier stress. Kneeling down, he softly asked, "Would you like a bottle of water?" Ebony nodded. Jacqueline instructed Ebony to sit down and take deep breaths, while David quickly grabbed a cold bottle of water from a nearby vending machine. When he returned, Ebony took the bottle, sipping carefully before closing her eyes for a brief, calming moment. Jacqueline gently stroked Ebony's head, finding comfort in the closeness between mother and daughter. Then she cupped Ebony's cheek, whispering a reminder. "You're safe now." Ebony leaned into her mother, exhaling a shaky breath. About 15 minutes later, a tall woman in a vibrant floral dress, her curly hair bouncing as she hurried into the waiting area, scanned the room with anxious eyes. The moment she spotted Ebony and Jacqueline, she rushed toward them, calling their names. Ebony looked up, a faint smile breaking across her tired face. This was Latrice, the cousin they had traveled to see. Latrice enveloped both mother and daughter in a tight embrace, her eyes brimming with tears as she sensed that something terrible had happened. Jacqueline's voice shook as she recounted everything. Harriet's hostility, the assault, David's intervention, and now the legal process ahead. Latrice listened in horror, holding Ebony close, apologizing over and over, saying how deeply sorry she was that Ebony had endured such cruelty. David introduced himself, explaining his role in the situation. Latrice thanked him profusely, still shaken but now determined to help Ebony heal from the traumatic experience. She asked if Ebony needed to go to the hospital, but Jacqueline reassured her that the medical staff had already examined her and confirmed that she was fine, aside from the bruise. Latrice gently touched Ebony's bruised arm, and the little girl winced slightly, but quickly reassured her aunt, "I'm okay." David stepped back, giving them space. He made a quick call to confirm details with the police, then returned to the group, informing Jacqueline that officers might need additional statements in the coming days. But for now they were free to continue their trip. Latrice offered to drive them home, assuring them that Ebony could rest during the ride. She also invited David to join them in case he needed a ride or wanted to stop for a meal. David politely thanked her but explained that he needed to pick up his rental car. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small notebook, jotted down his personal contact information, and handed it to Jacqueline. "If you need anything," he said, "legal assistance, emotional support, or even just someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to reach out." Jacqueline tucked the note into her purse, tears welling up again as she thanked him, calling him an angel in plain clothes. Ebony also whispered a soft thank you, still hugging her stuffed giraffe long neck, though she could only manage a small weary smile. David gently patted her shoulder. "Stay strong, kiddo," he told her. "The world needs hearts as resilient as yours." As they parted ways, David watched Latrice lead Jacqueline and Ebony toward the exit. Ebony leaned her head against her mother's side, her yellow dress wrinkled after everything she had endured. A storm of emotions swelled in David's chest. Relief that he had protected a child from further harm. Rage at the senseless racism that had caused it all. And sorrow for the innocence that had been bruised by such an unjust attack. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his short hair, reminding himself that justice would take its course. Harriet would face the consequences. A few days later, Jacqueline and Ebony visited Latrice's new bakery for its grand opening. The shop was filled with bright pastel-colored walls and the warm aroma of fresh pastries and bread. Despite the painful events of the past few days, Ebony's excitement shone through. She wore another yellow dress, determined not to let bad experiences overshadow her joy. The memories of that day couldn't be erased, but yellow remained her favorite color. Latrice introduced Ebony to a small group of children who had come with their parents. At first, Ebony was reserved, still haunted by what had happened. But slowly she opened up, smiling just a little when she discovered they shared a love for sweets. Jacqueline tried to enjoy the celebration, offering polite smiles to Latrice's friends and colleagues. But a lingering sadness weighed heavily on her heart. She kept replaying Harriet's hateful glare, the terrifying punch that shook Ebony's small frame. She reminded herself that things were okay now, that the worst part was over. But every time Ebony flinched when a stranger approached too quickly, Jacqueline felt a pang of worry, knowing it would take time for her daughter to heal from the trauma. Meanwhile, David had returned to his original plans, renting a small beachfront house, hoping for a quiet vacation. However, the memory of Ebony never quite left his mind. On the third day after the incident, he received a call from the local police department, requesting to confirm a few details from his statement. He reaffirmed the events, describing Harriet's unprovoked attack in her hateful words. The officers thanked him for his cooperation and informed him that Harriet was being charged with assault. And depending on the prosecutor's review, she could face hate crime charges as well. David felt a small sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice was in motion. But he also understood that the legal process would be long and challenging. One afternoon, David sat at a seaside cafe, sipping coffee near the ocean. The peaceful atmosphere surrounded him, but he still couldn't shake the image of Ebony from his mind. Then his phone rang. Glancing at the screen, he saw Jacqueline's number. He answered, hearing her soft voice on the other end, once again thanking him for protecting Ebony. She admitted that Ebony hadn't been sleeping well, often waking up from nightmares of Harriet looming over her. David felt his stomach tighten with frustration. It pained him to know that the little girl was still suffering. He gently asked if they had considered therapy. Jacqueline admitted that she was looking into it, but she was concerned about the cost. Without hesitation, David offered to reach out to a local victim support organization, explaining that they often helped arrange counseling services. Jacqueline's voice trembled with relief, promising to discuss the matter with her husband, Taryn. After saying goodbye, David immediately got to work. His position at the FBI gave him insight into trauma support networks, allowing him to navigate the system efficiently. By evening, he had arranged a phone consultation with a renowned child psychologist, who agreed to provide a free counseling session for Ebony. David forwarded the details to Jacqueline. She was nearly speechless with gratitude. He reassured her that Ebony's mental well-being was the top priority and that she was not alone in this. That evening, Jacqueline shared David's kindness with Latrice. Latrice, who was kneading dough in the bakery kitchen, paused for a moment, expressing deep admiration for David's compassion. She mentioned that Ebony had been in better spirits that day, even giggling when tasting a batch of freshly made whipped cream. However, the nightmare still worried them. Latrice also noted that news of the attack was spreading, and many customers at the bakery had asked about Ebony's well-being. Some had even donated, while others had left heartfelt messages of support. The community was outraged by Harriet's actions. Later, Jacqueline and Ebony visited a quiet cafe, where they could sit and talk without distractions. Ebony seemed more at ease, and a small smile had begun to return to her face, though a trace of anxiety still lingered in her eyes. Jacqueline felt a wave of relief, seeing her daughter slowly recovering. But the worry for the days ahead remained in her heart. She continued to monitor each of Ebony's therapy sessions, knowing that every small step forward was a significant victory. David sat across from them, his smile unable to fully hide the fatigue from days of working with legal authorities. He inquired about Ebony's therapy sessions and sighed in relief upon hearing that she had been making progress. Jacqueline thanked him once again, her gratitude for his support, both legally and emotionally, endless. "David, I don't even know how to thank you," Jacqueline said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've helped us so much, not just legally but emotionally too." David simply smiled, saying it was the right thing to do. He also updated them on the case, reassuring them that everything was moving in the right direction. All evidence had been carefully prepared for court. Harriet was still facing charges, and although her lawyer was attempting to argue that her actions were caused by temporary stress, the overwhelming evidence of a hate crime, along with the passengers' video recordings, was undeniable. Jacqueline felt somewhat reassured by this news, but she also knew there was still a long road ahead. No matter how long and exhausting the legal battle might be, she was determined not to give up. "We will keep fighting, for Ebony and for justice," she declared, squeezing her daughter's hand. Lunch passed with a lighter atmosphere than in previous days, but Jacqueline knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. She was determined not to let anything hinder Ebony's recovery and held on to the belief that justice would prevail. David met them at a quiet cafe near Latrice's bakery. Ebony's face lit up when she saw him. This time, she wore a bright yellow headband, a small but powerful sign that she refused to let the attack take away her joy. David handed Ebony a small gift, a children's book about a brave girl overcoming her fears. Ebony's eyes sparkled as she thanked him. Jacqueline smiled and told David that his kindness had been a lifeline for their family. She mentioned that Ebony often spoke about him, referring to him as the kind policeman who protected me. They chatted about ordinary things: the weather, Ebony's upcoming trip to an amusement park with Latrice, and the new pastries Latrice had started selling. David also mentioned a child-friendly aquarium in the area, one that Ebony might enjoy visiting if she felt up to it. Ebony's excitement grew at the mention of sea turtles, her curiosity sparking again. David then surprised them with free admission passes, a gift from a friend who worked at the aquarium. Jacqueline happily accepted, deeply touched by the many ways David had helped bring smiles back into Ebony's life. As days turned into weeks, the light in Ebony's eyes slowly began to return. The nightmares became less frequent, though they hadn't disappeared entirely. The bruise on Ebony's arm faded, but the emotional scars healed at a much slower pace. She would sometimes still ask her mother, "Why did Harriet hate me?" Jacqueline did her best to explain that sometimes, people are consumed by prejudice and anger, and that it had nothing to do with the worth of the person they hurt. A month later, Harriet's preliminary trial took place. Jacqueline flew back to attend, this time with Terrence and Ebony by her side. The trial was tense, but Ebony was not required to testify directly. Instead, she expressed her emotions through drawing, a way for her to release feelings that words couldn't fully capture. Ebony's drawings reflected her struggles with pain and trauma, but over time they also began to show recovery and hope. Jacqueline and Terrence stood by her every step of the way, providing comfort, love, and reassurance, helping Ebony feel the security and stability she needed throughout the process. As the trial approached, David remained by the family's side, always ready to offer both legal and emotional support. Each morning before court, Jacqueline would sit with Ebony, reminding her of the courage she had shown, and that she was not alone in this fight. Ebony had learned to recognize her emotions, confront her pain, and find ways to overcome it. Though the memories of that day still lingered, she had slowly begun to rediscover her innocence and joy. On the day of the official trial, Jacqueline, Terrence, and David sat together in the courtroom, all of them feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. But they knew this was a crucial step toward achieving justice for Ebony. As the evidence was presented and witnesses testified, it was impossible for those in the courtroom not to feel outraged by Harriet's actions. And finally, when the verdict was announced, they knew that their fight for justice had never been in vain. David could sense a powerful change in Ebony. The road ahead would still be long and challenging, but she had proven that she could rise above the darkness, reclaim her light, and most importantly, she would not let injustice steal her joy. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, community members and supporters, all eager to hear the outcome of the case. Inside, Jacqueline, Terrence, and Ebony sat in the back row, their hands clasped together, their hearts pounding with tension. Ebony sat quietly, her eyes still holding a flicker of worry, but she had learned how to face her emotions head-on. As the trial began, the evidence was laid out clearly. Passenger videos and witness testimonies only strengthened the prosecutor's case. Harriet, sitting across from them, stared at the proceedings, her expression filled with discomfort, but there was nothing she could do to change what was coming. Jacqueline glanced toward David, who sat nearby, closely observing every detail of the courtroom proceedings. Though he was no longer directly handling the case as an FBI agent, he remained committed to ensuring that justice was served. He wasn't just a legal advocate. He was a friend, a steadfast companion through the darkest days. Throughout the trial, Ebony never had to take the witness stand, but she could still feel the support from her family and community. They shielded her from further pain, helping her step out of the shadows without leaving scars on her soul. Though the case had dragged on, Jacqueline felt reassured, because they no longer had to face it alone. Finally, after long days in court, the verdict was announced. Harriet was convicted, held accountable for her actions. The entire family breathed a sigh of relief, not because they took pleasure in someone's punishment, but because they had secured justice for Ebony, restoring her faith in a world that could still be fair. Jacqueline held Ebony tightly, relieved that her daughter had overcome one of the biggest challenges of her young life. She thanked everyone who had stood by their family, helping them navigate through the storm and into the light. The public had closely followed the case through news reports, and the presiding judge was known for their strict, no-nonsense approach. Harriet's defense attorneys attempted to argue that she had been suffering from extreme mental distress, that personal struggles had led her to act impulsively. They even hinted that Ebony's mother had exaggerated the racial discrimination aspect of Harriet's behavior. However, the prosecution delivered a powerful case. They called multiple witnesses, passengers who had seen Harriet's hostility firsthand during the flight, heard her racially charged insults, and, of course, witnessed her physical attack. David also took the stand, testifying both as a witness and as an off-duty FBI agent who had intervened. He calmly recounted how Harriet had attacked Ebony without provocation, how she had used hateful language, and how Ebony had done nothing to deserve such violence. His testimony was firm, unshakable, leaving little room for doubt. Then the final piece of evidence sealed the case. A video recording from the plane was played in court. The footage captured Harriet's enraged screams, her vicious words, and most damning of all, the moment she struck Ebony. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the video played. Ebony's terrified face, her tiny fists clenched, her screams of panic, and David grabbing Harriet's wrist to stop further harm. The clip ended with the chaos of the passengers, some shouting for help, others filming the horrifying scene as it unfolded. Jacqueline offered words of encouragement, thanking Lucy for her support, and reminding her that no one could have predicted such an extreme act. She knew that Lucy felt guilty, but Jacqueline also understood that sometimes, there are things we simply cannot control. The hallway outside the courtroom was thick with tension. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. David, Jacqueline, Terrence, and Ebony's psychologist stood close together, all anxiously awaiting the verdict. They knew that whatever decision was made, it would deeply impact Ebony and her family's future. Lucy, the other flight attendant, was also present. Her face tense, nervously biting her nails. She told Jacqueline that she hoped for a swift and fair verdict. She also apologized for not recognizing the warning signs about Harriet earlier, a mistake that weighed heavily on her conscience. Jacqueline gave her a gentle smile, reassuring her. What matters now is that we stand together. Time crawled forward, every second stretching the weight of their anticipation. They all felt the pressure bearing down, hoping that justice would be served, that this case would allow Ebony to turn the page, to step into a new chapter of her life, one where she would no longer have to live in the shadow of fear and pain. Harriet was consumed by anger and resentment. She didn't look back. She just kept walking as if unable to accept the reality of her conviction. But for Jacqueline and Terence, the worry and tension they had carried for so long finally began to lift. There was a sense of relief but also a deep quietness, a solemn recognition that, though justice had been served, this was only the first step in Ebony's journey. Jacqueline held her daughter tightly, finding immense comfort in seeing Ebony standing beside her, her eyes no longer filled with fear. Ebony's tiny hand still clutched her stuffed giraffe long neck, as if it were an essential part of her healing process. Jacqueline knew that Ebony would never forget what had happened, but at least now they no longer had to live in fear. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them again, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward Jacqueline and Terence. This time Terence stepped forward, his voice calm yet powerful as he spoke. "We are grateful for the jury's decision," he said, "and we hope this verdict sends a clear message that racial violence against children will never be tolerated." Behind him, Jacqueline stood with tears shimmering in her eyes, her arms still wrapped around Ebony's beloved stuffed giraffe, the same one she had clung to throughout the flight. In the weeks that followed, Harriet's sentencing trial took place. The judge delivered a harsh sentence, emphasizing that violence driven by hatred was a grave threat to society. Harriet was led away in silence, her eyes still burning with anger and resentment. But now, all she could do was face the consequences of her actions. Wearing a bitter expression of defiance, some onlookers applauded, while others simply stood in silence, witnessing the final chapter of a tragedy, a stark reminder of the destructive power of racism. In the months that followed, Ebony's life slowly returned to normal. She continued therapy, focusing on coping strategies to handle the lingering fears. Jacqueline and Terence did everything they could to maintain stability in Ebony's daily life. She no longer cried at night, and the painful memory of the punch was gradually replaced by the reality that justice had been served. Nearly a year later, Ebony flew again, this time on a different airline. At first she felt nervous, but Jacqueline gently reminded her, one person's hatred does not define everyone. This time, Ebony encountered kind flight attendants, ones who treated her with warmth and care, noticing her bright yellow dress and her sweet personality. The captain even gifted her a small pair of plastic pilot wings. David Morales remained in touch, occasionally calling to check on Ebony's progress. And sometimes, in the background, he could hear her cheerful voice. Jacqueline always reassured him. Ebony was doing much better now. Terence and David had even formed an unexpected friendship, bonded by the intensity of the crisis they had endured together. David sometimes joked that Ebony had done him a favor, reminding him why he had joined the FBI in the first place, to protect the vulnerable and uphold justice. Over time, Ebony's experience became part of a larger conversation about racism. The media ran special reports, highlighting how a child's courage and an off-duty agent's quick intervention had brought attention to the issue. Ebony's story resonated far beyond the passengers on that flight. Social media posts praising her resilience and David's bravery spread widely, sparking discussions about racial discrimination across industries. Jacqueline and Latrice later partnered to organize a community program, inviting local children to the bakery for events that promoted inclusivity, kindness, and mutual respect. Ebony became the program's ambassador, at first shy but gradually growing more confident as she realized that sharing her story could help others. At one event, Ebony stood before a group of children, reading a poem she had written about overcoming fear. The audience applauded warmly, and Ebony bowed, her smile bashful but proud. From the sidelines, Jacqueline watched, tears welling in her eyes. She saw how far her daughter had come. Then she spotted David in the crowd. He had driven in to attend the event. Their eyes met and they exchanged a knowing smile. David nodded in encouragement, proud of Ebony, because she was no longer just the child who had once been struck by a hateful flight attendant. She had become a beacon of hope. A testament to how love and support could overcome even the darkest moments of ignorance. Ebony was only 8 years old when Harriet attacked her. But as her 10th birthday approached, the emotional scars had begun to fade, transforming into lessons that made her stronger and wiser. She remembered the fear, the confusion. But she also remembered the love she had received from kind strangers, the unwavering protection of her mother, and the unyielding determination of David Morales, who had never hesitated to stand up and act. Ebony had learned that the world could still be a place of kindness, that even in the face of cruelty, there would always be people willing to stand up and do what was right. David felt warmth spread through his chest. A flight that was supposed to be just another trip had instead become a turning point, connecting people in ways he had never imagined. Every smile, every hug, every joyful moment today reflected the steady steps this family had taken together. He couldn't help but feel proud, not just for helping them through the storm, but for helping Ebony find her smile again. As Ebony prepared to blow out her candles, the room filled with laughter and happiness. She carefully closed her eyes, made a wish, and blew gently. Cheers and applause erupted around her. Jacqueline stood beside her, eyes glistening with emotion, knowing they had come such a long way. And today all they felt was peace and joy. As the party continued with games, cake, and heartfelt wishes, David sat quietly in a corner watching the family, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had truly made a difference. Ebony, with her unwavering resilience, had not only overcome her fears, but had transformed them into a source of strength. Now she was able to fully embrace the joy of the moment, surrounded by family and friends. David left the party with a sense of peace and happiness, knowing that, while there would always be challenges ahead, today they had all reached a new milestone, a brighter future for Ebony and her family. Later that evening, Ebony spoke excitedly about seeing new places. Jacqueline felt a wave of quiet joy as she listened. She knew that Ebony had regained her strength, not only moving past her past, but now looking toward the future with excitement and curiosity. She no longer let fear or painful memories define her life. As the days passed, Ebony's recovery continued to progress. Though the painful events remained a part of their past, the family had learned to live with them, refusing to let them shape their future. Instead of dwelling in the shadows, they had found light. In moments of happiness, in love, and in the unwavering support of those around them. Ebony continued to participate in community programs, becoming a symbol of strength and resilience. She was no longer just a victim of racial discrimination. She was now a testament to recovery, a living proof that a strong heart could overcome any challenge. Jacqueline and Terrence felt immensely proud of their daughter. Her courage and resilience had not only helped her heal, but had also allowed them to see the beauty in life again. They knew that no matter how many hardships lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. Ebony was no longer the frightened little girl from the past. She had grown into a young girl with an open heart, filled with hope and determination. She had learned that even in an unjust world, love, protection, and faith in justice would always help people rise above adversity. Her family understood that life would never be perfect, but together they would always find a way forward. Anteing to spread kindness wherever they went, Jacqueline began planning a future family trip, a vacation that would show Ebony the beauty of the world, far from the darkness they had once endured. Terrence wholeheartedly agreed, and together they began saving for the trip so they could travel comfortably. They also planned to invite David to join them, if his schedule allowed. After all, Ebony now saw him as part of their family. The thought of this adventure made Ebony's eyes sparkle, brimming with excitement and anticipation. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacqueline sat with Ebony on the porch swing, sipping on glasses of lemonade. Ebony told her mother that she was glad Harriet hadn't ruined flying for her. She admitted that she still felt sad about what had happened. Jacqueline nodded, acknowledging that her sadness was valid. But then, Ebony said she wanted to focus on the good that had come afterward. The friends who had supported her, the teachers who had encouraged her, and the hero who had stepped in to protect her. She said she wouldn't waste any more tears on someone filled with hatred. Instead, she would save her energy for loving those who deserved it. Jacqueline felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of pride for her daughter's strength. She pulled Ebony into a hug, telling her that not everyone has the courage to see the good in a bad situation. Ebony shrugged and said that was exactly the kind of person she wanted to be, a brave girl who sang her songs, wore her yellow dresses, and looked out of airplane windows to watch the clouds. Jacqueline kissed Ebony's forehead, whispering that she would always be by her side, no matter what. Later, Ebony lay in bed, clutching her soft plush toy, feeling at peace. The clouds drifted past the window, and she thought about everything she had been through, and all the good things she had found after the pain. She remembered her first flight after the ordeal, but this time she felt no fear. She had grown, become stronger, and now she looked at the world with eyes full of hope. Terrence sat beside her, his eyes filled with love and pride. As the plane took off, Ebony felt herself rising higher, not just physically but emotionally as well. She knew that no matter what happened in the future, her family would always be by her side, and people like David, who had protected her and helped her see the light in the world again, would always be a source of strength and inspiration for her to keep moving forward. This time, when Ebony looked out the plane window, the clouds were no longer reminders of fear, but symbols of freedom. A reminder that she had overcome hardships, and was now moving forward with strength and hope. She held her stuffed giraffe, long-necked, tightly in her hands, a piece of her past, and a reminder of the journey she had endured. But now it was more than just a toy. It was a symbol of resilience, of the strength that had carried her through life's toughest challenges. Ebony had replaced her old giraffe with a new one, as the original had become worn and frayed from years of comfort and use. She hugged the new plush tightly, and for a moment the memories flooded back. The fear she had once felt, the pain of Harriet's fist. But as the plane soared higher, Ebony felt lighter. A gentle smile crossed her lips. She had refused to let hatred define her story. As the plane descended, Terrence held her hand firmly, and together they stepped onto the ground. The warm California sun greeted them, and Ebony took a deep breath, thinking about all the new possibilities this place held. She was ready to meet family, to explore the beaches, and maybe even visit Hollywood. As they moved through the airport, Ebony realized that flying could be safe, and even magical, a way to explore new horizons. Hatred and racism would always exist in the world, but she refused to let them stop her from living fully. Silently, in her heart, she thanked David Morales once again. Back home, David continued his life with a renewed sense of purpose. He took on new FBI assignments, handling fraud cases, organized crime, and sometimes civil rights violations. He remained as vigilant as he had been on that flight, always ready to stand against injustice. He never forgot Ebony's tear-streaked face, and it fueled his determination. If he could stop Harriet from hurting Ebony, maybe he could also prevent greater crimes. Every case became an opportunity to uphold his oath to protect and serve, without discrimination. Sometimes David received postcards from Ebony, each one stamped with a different place she had visited with her family. One postcard featured a Disney castle, another showed a serene beach, and in every single one there was Ebony, beaming in her bright yellow dress, her smile radiant and full of joy. Many positive changes began to take root in the community. Ebony's story, from pain to strength, inspired countless people, not just in her neighborhood but far beyond. Latrice's bakery became a gathering place, a hub for love and connection, where stories of courage, forgiveness, and kindness were shared and passed on. Though still a teenager, Ebony had become a symbol of resilience and compassion. She participated in bakery events, sometimes reading poetry, or displaying her paintings on the walls, expressions of creativity and a desire to change the world. She was no longer just a child who had been hurt. She was a young girl with vision and an open heart. And as parents brought their children to the events, they too passed down a valuable lesson, a lesson of respect and empathy. Jacqueline felt immensely proud of her daughter. Ebony was not just a survivor. She was a force for change in her community. Despite the challenges of work and life, Jacqueline never lost sight of her greatest goal, to ensure that Ebony grew up in an environment filled with love and support. She even cut back on her second job, to spend more time with her daughter. And she didn't forget about her own growth either, enrolling in night classes to further her career. Terrence had also found a better-paying job, easing the financial burden on the family. Their home was now filled with laughter and new possibilities. From time to time they would sit together and reflect on the day Ebony was attacked. But now they did so not to dwell in sadness, but to measure how far they had come. They used that memory as a stepping stone, a way to grow stronger and closer as a family. With steady steps, they had rebuilt their lives, a life filled with hope and love. Ebony had learned that pain could lead to strength and change, and she continued to live with courage, confidence, and faith in a brighter future. The solidarity within their neighborhood reassured her that adversity could either break people apart or bring them closer together. And in their case, it had brought out the best in many. As years passed, Ebony grew into a confident teenager. At 15, she volunteered at a local organization that helped guide children through difficult circumstances. She met kids who were facing bullying, homelessness, and even racial discrimination. She shared her story of resilience, careful not to glorify pain, but instead emphasizing the power of support and love. The children admired her honesty. Some even opened up about their own fears. She listened patiently, and often told them about David, the off-duty agent who had stepped in when she needed help the most. She reminded them that help could come from unexpected places, and that speaking up was always important. David received occasional updates from Ebony, hearing about her volunteer work, her academic progress, and her blossoming artistic talent. He felt immensely proud of her journey. His colleagues sometimes teased him for his special interest in a child he had barely known before that fateful flight. But David never downplayed the significance of that event. That flight remained etched in his mind, more than any high-profile FBI case, because it had revealed both the cruelty of humanity and the extraordinary potential for kindness that each person could bring into the world. One day on a plane, had created a bond that transcended all conventional boundaries. When Ebony applied to colleges, she had a powerful personal essay to include in her applications. She wrote about how a moment of injustice could transform into a powerful force for change. She described how love and support had helped her overcome and rise above it all. A persistent force for positive change. Ebony chose not to dwell on Harriet's name or the violence she endured. Instead, she focused on the strength of empathy, the importance of mentorship, and the life-changing impact that a bystander could have. When they chose to step in and take action, admissions officers, moved by her story and determination, sent her acceptance letters from multiple universities. Ebony ultimately chose a program focused on social justice and community development, determined to become an advocate for those society had cast aside. On the night before Ebony left for college, Jacqueline cooked her a special meal. Terrence decorated the house with banners that read, "Congratulations, Ebony." Latrice brought over a big cake to celebrate. Friends and family gathered, sharing funny childhood stories about Ebony and offering words of wisdom for her future. David, away on an FBI assignment, couldn't be there in person, but he sent a video message instead. He praised Ebony for turning a painful encounter into a beacon of compassion. Ebony watched his video with a grateful smile, tears welling in her eyes, as she listened to him speak about how proud he was of her achievements. When Ebony arrived at her dorm, she carefully unpacked her favorite belongings, framed family photos, postcards, and souvenirs from her journey. Among them was the stuffed giraffe she had with her on the day of Harriet's attack. It had been stitched up in a few places, but was still as precious as ever. She placed it on her bed and took a moment to reflect. She was older, stronger, and that day on the plane was now just a chapter in her story. It had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. When asked if she was considering joining the FBI, Ebony laughed and said she was still exploring other ways to help her community, but she knew that justice would always be a goal she wanted to pursue. She shared that she had been learning so much in college and was eager to apply her knowledge to real-world work, especially in supporting communities facing racial discrimination and social injustices. David smiled as he listened, proud of how far Ebony had come. He encouraged her to keep following that path, knowing she was destined to make a difference. As Ebony shared her academic experiences and the progress she was making in her studies, David felt a sense of pride beyond words. Ebony's journey, from a wounded child to a strong young woman fighting for justice and equality, had truly inspired him. With every conversation, David found renewed faith in justice and the ideals he had dedicated his life to. Throughout these discussions, Ebony could also feel David's unwavering support. Though he couldn't always be there in person, he remained a constant source of encouragement, helping her stay strong on the challenging path she had chosen. She knew she was not alone in this journey, and that people like David would always be by her side, whether through online conversations or in life's most defining moments. Jacqueline and Terrence watched with immense pride and joy. They had witnessed their daughter grow from a fearful child to a confident, strong, and compassionate young woman, dedicated to making a difference. Jacqueline didn't just see Ebony's success in her work. She could feel the transformation in her heart. A transformation built on kindness and resilience. Terrence was always by Ebony's side, encouraging and supporting her through every step of her journey. Though financial struggles were no longer a concern, they felt true happiness watching Ebony pursue her passion and help those in need. The moments they spent as a family, reflecting on the road they had traveled, made them realize that every past hardship had paved the way for a future filled with hope. Ebony was no longer just a girl who overcame adversity. She had become a source of inspiration for an entire community. As she continued her work in social advocacy, her experiences taught her that real change came from understanding, listening, and taking action. She proved that one person could transform the world around them. And for Ebony, that was a mission she would never abandon. Yellow, the color of hope, creativity, and courage. The same yellow dress she had worn on that fateful day had now become a symbol of resilience, of strength, and of optimism that carried her through her journey. Years later, as Ebony sat with her children, she told them the story of the small stuffed giraffe that she had carried with her since childhood. She spoke not only of pain, but of the power of love, resilience, and the unwavering support of family. Her stories were more than memories of difficult times. They were lessons on overcoming injustice and inspiring future generations. Her children would look at her with admiration. Even if they couldn't yet fully grasp the significance of that moment, they could feel the strength and unconditional love she had passed on to them. Every day, Ebony continued to live with perseverance, leading others with compassion and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her story was not just about overcoming hardship. It was about how people could turn their darkest moments into opportunities to bring light to the world around them. Her entire family had become a symbol of resilience, of endless love, and of the strength to stand against injustice. Yellow, the color of sunlight, of persistence, the light that shines through even the darkest clouds. For Ebony, yellow was more than just a color. It was a symbol of hope that never fades, of endless optimism, and of an unshakable belief in a brighter future, no matter the challenges ahead. She had chosen to live with courage and determination, using even the most painful parts of her past to build a life of meaning, one that spread love, justice, and hope to all those around her. On a peaceful afternoon, as the golden hues of the sunset cast a warm glow through the window, Ebony sat in her favorite chair, quietly watching her children play in the garden. Their laughter echoed through the air as they ran freely, chasing butterflies, their eyes filled with the excitement and innocence of childhood. She smiled softly, reminiscing about the days she had lived through, the hardships, the moments of despair, but above all, the people who had helped her rise again. She placed her hand on the worn-out stuffed giraffe beside her, which no longer symbolized pain but stood as a testament to the journey she had taken. One of her children ran up to her, wrapping their small arms around her and looking up with curious eyes. "Mom, have you ever been afraid?" Ebony bent down, gently stroking her child's soft hair. "Of course, my love," she said tenderly. "But I've learned that fear does not define who we are. What truly matters is what we choose to do when we face it." The child thought for a moment, then beamed brightly. "Then I will be like you. I will always be strong and never let injustice hold me back." Ebony pulled her child close, feeling the warmth of a small yet determined heartbeat. She knew that what she had endured had not only helped her grow but had also paved the way for the next generation, one filled with resilience, love, and the courage to fight for a better world. And as the night settled in, she gazed up at the sky, where the stars shimmered in the vast darkness. Life may have its moments of shadow, but she believed, just like the light of the stars, just like the golden glow of the sun, that hope and love would always remain, spreading, guiding, and illuminating the path for those who dared to keep moving forward.